Chapter 10 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 10. Patty's Place. The next evening found them treading resolutely the herringbone walk through the tiny garden. The April wind was filling the pine trees with its roundelay, and the grove was alive with robins, great, plump, saucy fellows, strutting along the paths. The girls rang rather timidly, and were admitted by a grim and ancient handmaiden. The door opened directly into a large living-room, where by a cheery little fire sat two other ladies, both of whom were also grim and ancient. Except that one looked to be about 70 and the other 50, there seemed little difference between them. Each had amazingly big, light-blue eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles. Each wore a cap and a grey shawl. Each was knitting without haste and without rest. Each rocked placidly and looked at the girls without speaking. And just behind each sat a large white china dog, with round green spots all over it, a green nose, and green ears. Those dogs captured Anne's fancy on the spot. They seemed like the twin guardian deities of Patty's Place. For a few minutes nobody spoke. The girls were too nervous to find words, and neither the ancient ladies nor the china dogs seemed conversationally inclined. Anne glanced about the room. What a dear place it was! Another door opened out of it directly into the pine grove, and the robins came boldly up on the very step. The floor was spotted with round, braided mats, such as Marilla made at Green Gables, but which were considered out of date everywhere else, even in Avonlea. And yet here they were on Spofford Avenue. A big, polished grandfather's clock ticked loudly and solemnly in a corner. There were delightful little cupboards over the mantelpiece, behind whose glass doors gleamed quaint bits of china. The walls were hung with old prints and silhouettes. In one corner the stairs went up, and at the first low turn was a long window with an inviting seat. It was all just as Anne had known it must be. By this time the silence had grown too dreadful, and Priscilla nudged Anne to intimate that she must speak. We saw by your sign that this house is to let," said Anne faintly, addressing the older lady, who was evidently Miss Patty Spofford.
"Oh, yes,"
said Miss Patty.
"I intended to take that sign down today."
Then we are too late," said Anne sorrowfully. "You've let it to someone else?"
"No, but we have decided not to let it at all."
"Oh, I'm so sorry!" exclaimed Anne impulsively. "I love this place so. I did hope we could have got it." Then did Miss Patty lay down her knitting, take off her specs, rub them, put them on again, and for the first time look at Anne as at a human being. The other lady followed her example so perfectly that she might as well have been a reflection in a mirror.
"You love it?"
said Miss Patty with emphasis.
"Does that mean that you really love it, or that you merely like the looks of it? The girls nowadays indulge in such exaggerated statements that one never can tell what they do mean. It wasn't so in my young days. Then a girl did not say she loved turnips in just the same tone as she might have said that she loved her mother or her Saviour."
Anne's conscience bore her up. "I really do love it," she said gently. "I've loved it ever since I saw it last fall. My two college chums and I want to keep house next year instead of boarding, so we are looking for a little place to rent, and when I saw that this house was to let I was so happy."
"If you love it, you can have it,"
said Miss Patty.
"Maria and I decided today that we would not let it after all, because we did not like any of the people who have wanted it. We don't have to let it. We can afford to go to Europe even if we don't let it. It would help us out, but not for gold will I let my home pass into the possession of such people as have come here and looked at it. You are different. I believe you do love it, and will be good to it. You can have it."
If we can afford to pay what you ask for it," hesitated Anne. Miss Patty named the amount required. Anne and Priscilla looked at each other. Priscilla shook her head. "I'm afraid we can't afford quite so much," said Anne, choking back her disappointment. "You see, we are only college girls, and we are poor."
"What were you thinking you could afford?"
demanded Miss Patty, ceasing not to knit. Anne named her amount. Miss Patty nodded gravely.
"That will do," As I told you, it is not strictly necessary that we should let it at all. We are not rich, but we have enough to go to Europe on. I have never been in Europe in my life, and never expected or wanted to go, but my niece there, Maria Spofford, has taken a fancy to go. Now you know a young person like Maria can't go globe-trotting alone."
"No, I suppose not," murmured Anne, seeing that Miss Patty was quite solemnly in earnest.
"Of course not. So I have to go along to look after her. I expect to enjoy it, too. I'm 70 years old, but I'm not tired of living yet. I dare say I'd have gone to Europe before if the idea had occurred to me. We shall be away for 2 years, perhaps 3. We sail in June, and we shall send you the key and leave all in order for you to take possession when you choose. We shall pack away a few things we prize especially, but all the rest will be left."
"Will you leave the china dogs?" asked Anne timidly.
"Would you like me to?"
"Oh, indeed, yes, they are delightful." A pleased expression came into Miss Patty's face.
"I think a great deal of those dogs,"
she said proudly.
"They are over 100 years old, and they have sat on either side of this fireplace ever since my brother Aaron brought them from London 50 years ago. Spofford Avenue was called after my brother Aaron."
A fine man he was,
said Miss Maria, speaking for the first time.
"He was a good uncle to you, Maria,"
said Miss Patty, with evident emotion.
"You do well to remember him."
I shall always remember him,
said Miss Maria solemnly.
I can see him this minute standing there before that fire, with his hands under his coat-tails, beaming on us.
Miss Maria took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes, but Miss Patty came resolutely back from the regions of sentiment to those of business.
"I shall leave the dogs where they are if you will promise to be very careful of them,"
she said.
"Their names are Gog and Magog. Gog looks to the right and Magog to the left. And there's just one more thing. You don't object, I hope, to this house being called Patty's Place?"
"No, indeed. We think that is one of the nicest things about it."
"You have sense, I see,"
said Miss Patty in a tone of great satisfaction.
"Would you believe it? All the people who came here to rent the house wanted to know if they couldn't take the name off the gate during their occupation of it. I told them roundly that the name went with the house. This has been Patty's Place ever since my brother Aaron left it to me in his will, and Patty's Place it shall remain until I die and Maria dies. After that happens, the next possessor can call it any fool name he likes,"
concluded Miss Patty, much as she might have said, "After that, the deluge."
"And now, wouldn't you like to go over the house and see it all before we consider this bargain made?"
Further exploration still further delighted the girls. Besides the big living room, there was a kitchen and a small bedroom downstairs. Upstairs were 3 rooms, 1 large and 2 small. Anne took an especial fancy to one of the small ones, looking out into the big pines, and hoped it would be hers. It was papered in pale blue, and had a little old-timey toilet table with sconces for candles. There was a diamond-paned window with a seat under the blue muslin frills that would be a satisfying spot for studying or dreaming.
"It's all so delicious that I know we are going to wake up and find it a fleeting vision of the night,"
said Priscilla as they went away. "Miss Patty and Miss Maria are hardly such stuff as dreams are made of," laughed Anne. "Can you fancy them globe-trotting, especially in those shawls and caps?"
"I suppose they'll take them off when they really begin to trot,"
said Priscilla.
"but I know they'll take their knitting with them everywhere. They simply couldn't be parted from it. They will walk about Westminster Abbey and knit, I feel sure. Meanwhile, Anne, we shall be living in Patty's Place and on Spofford Avenue. I feel like a millionairess even now."
"I feel like one of the morning stars that sang for joy," said Anne. Phil Gordon crept into 38 St. John's that night and flung herself on Anne's bed.
"Girls, dear, I'm tired to death. I feel like the man without a country. Or was it without a shadow? I forget which. Anyway, I've been packing up."
"And I suppose you are worn out because you couldn't decide which things to pack first or where to put them,"
laughed Priscilla.
"Exactly. And when I had got everything jammed in somehow, and my landlady and her maid had both sat on it while I locked it, I discovered I had packed a whole lot of things I wanted for convocation at the very bottom. I had to unlock the old thing and poke and dive into it for an hour before I fished out what I wanted. I would get hold of something that felt like what I was looking for, and I'd yank it up, and it would be something else. No, Anne, I did not swear."
I didn't say you did.
Well, you looked it, but I admit my thoughts verged on the profane. And I have such a cold in the head, I can do nothing but sniffle, sigh, and sneeze. Isn't that alliterative agony for you? Queen Anne, do say something to cheer me up.
Remember that next Thursday night you'll be back in the land of Alec and Alonzo, suggested Anne. Phil shook her head dolefully.
More alliteration. No, I don't want Alec and Alonzo when I have a cold in the head. But what has happened, you two? Now that I look at you closely, you seem all lighted up with an internal iridescence. Why, you're actually shining! What's up?
We are going to live in Patty's Place next winter, said Anne triumphantly. Live, mark you, not board. We've rented it, and Stella Maynard is coming, and her aunt is going to keep house for us. Phil bounced up, wiped her nose, and fell on her knees before Anne.
Girls, girls, let me come too. Oh, I'll be so good. If there's no room for me, I'll sleep in the little doghouse in the orchard. I've seen it. Only let me come.
Get up, you goose.
I won't stir off my marrow bones till you tell me I can live with you next winter.
Anne and Priscilla looked at each other. Then Anne said slowly, Phil, dear, we'd love to have you, but we may as well speak plainly. I'm poor, Pris is poor, Stella Maynard is poor. Our housekeeping will have to be very simple and our table plain. You'd have to live as we would. Now you are rich, and your boarding-house fare attests the fact.
Oh, what do I care for that?
Demanded Phil tragically.
Better a dinner of herbs where you chums are than a stalled ox in a lonely boarding-house. Don't think I'm all stomach, girls. I'll be willing to live on bread and water, with just a leetle jam, if you'll let me come.
And then, continued Anne, there will be a good deal of work to be done. Stella's aunt can't do it all. We all expect to have our chores to do. Now you—
Toil not, neither do I spin,
finished Philippa.
But I'll learn to do things. You'll only have to show me once. I can make my own bed to begin with. And remember that, though I can't cook, I can keep my temper. That's something. And I never growl about the weather. That's more. Oh, please, please, I never wanted anything so much in my life. And this floor is awfully hard.
There's just one more thing,
said Priscilla resolutely.
You, Phil, as all Redmond knows, entertain callers almost every evening. Now at Patty's Place we can't do that. We have decided that we shall be at home to our friends on Friday evenings only. If you come with us, you'll have to abide by that rule.
Well, you don't think I'll mind that, do you? Why, I'm glad of it. I knew I should have had some such rule myself, but I hadn't enough decision to make it or stick to it. When I can shuffle off the responsibility on you, it will be a real relief. If you won't let me cast in my lot with you, I'll die of the disappointment, and then I'll come back and haunt you. I'll camp on the very doorstep of Patty's Place, and you won't be able to go out or come in without falling over my spook.
Again Anne and Priscilla exchanged eloquent looks. Well, said Anne, of course we can't promise to take you until we've consulted with Stella, but I don't think she'll object, and as far as we are concerned, you may come in glad welcome.
If you get tired of our simple life, you can leave us, and no questions asked,
added Priscilla. Phil sprang up, hugged them both jubilantly, and went on her way rejoicing.
I hope things will go right,
said Priscilla soberly. We must make them go right, avowed Anne. I think Phil will fit into our 'appy little 'ome very well.
Oh, Phil's a dear to rattle around with and be chums, and of course the more there are of us the easier it will be on our slim purses. But how will she be to live with? You have to summer and winter with anyone before you know if she's livable or not.
Oh, well, we'll all be put to the test as far as that goes. And we must quit us like sensible folk, living and let live. Phil isn't selfish, though she's a little thoughtless, and I believe we will all get on beautifully in Patty's Place. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 11. The Round of Life. Anne was back in Avonlea with the luster of the Thorburn Scholarship on her brow. People told her she hadn't changed much, in a tone which hinted they were surprised and a little disappointed she hadn't. Avonlea had not changed either. At least, so it seemed at first. But as Anne sat in the Green Gables pew on the first Sunday after her return, and looked over the congregation, she saw several little changes which, all coming home to her at once, made her realize that time did not quite stand still, even in Avonlea. A new minister was in the pulpit. In the pews more than one familiar face was missing forever. Old Uncle Abe, his prophesying over and done with, Mrs. Peter Sloane, who had sighed, it was to be hoped, for the last time, Timothy Cotton, who, as Mrs. Rachel Lynde said, had actually managed to die at last after practising at it for 20 years, and old Josiah Sloane, whom nobody knew in his coffin because he had his whiskers neatly trimmed, were all sleeping in the little graveyard behind the church. And Billy Andrews was married to Nettie Blewett. They appeared out that Sunday. When Billy, beaming with pride and happiness, showed his beplumed and besilked bride into the Harmon Andrews pew, Anne dropped her lips to hide her dancing eyes. She recalled the stormy winter night of the Christmas holidays when Jane had proposed for Billy. He certainly had not broken his heart over his rejection. Anne wondered if Jane had also proposed to Nettie for him, or if he had mustered enough spunk to ask the fateful question himself. All the Andrews family seemed to share in his pride and pleasure, from Mrs. Harmon in the pew to Jane in the choir. Jane had resigned from the Avonlea school and intended to go west in the fall.
"Can't get a beau in Avonlea, that's what,"
said Mrs. Rachel Lynde scornfully.
"Says she thinks she'll have better health out west. I never heard her health was poor before."
"Jane is a nice girl," Anne had said loyally. "She never tried to attract attention, as some did."
"Oh, she never chased the boys, if that's what you mean,"
said Mrs. Rachel.
"but she'd like to be married just as much as anybody, that's what. What else would take her out west, to some forsaken place whose only recommendation is that men are plenty and women scarce? Don't you tell me."
But it was not at Jane Anne gazed that day in dismay and surprise. It was at Ruby Gillis, who sat beside her in the choir. What had happened to Ruby? She was even handsomer than ever, but her blue eyes were too bright and lustrous, and the colour of her cheeks was hectically brilliant. Besides, she was very thin. The hands that held her hymn-book were almost transparent in their delicacy. "Is Ruby Gillis ill?" Anne asked of Mrs. Lynde as they went home from church.
"Ruby Gillis is dying of galloping consumption,"
said Mrs. Lynde bluntly.
"Everybody knows it except herself and her family. They won't give in. If you ask them, she's perfectly well. She hasn't been able to teach since she had that attack of congestion in the winter, but she says she's going to teach again in the fall. And she's after the White Sands School. She'll be in her grave, poor girl, when White Sands School opens, that's what."
Anne listened in shocked silence. Ruby Gillis, her old school chum, dying? Could it be possible? Of late years they had grown apart, but the old tie of schoolgirl intimacy was there, and made itself felt sharply in the tug the news gave at Anne's heartstrings. Ruby, the brilliant, the merry, the coquettish. It was impossible to associate the thought of her with anything like death. She had greeted Anne with gay cordiality after church, and urged her to come up the next evening.
"I'll be away Tuesday and Wednesday evenings,"
she had whispered triumphantly.
"There's a concert at Carmody and a party at White Sands. Herb Spencer is going to take me. He's my latest. Be sure to come tomorrow. I'm dying for a good talk with you. I want to hear all about your doings at Redmond."
Anne knew that Ruby meant she wanted to tell Anne about her own recent flirtations, but she promised to go, and Diana offered to go with her.
"I've been wanting to go to see Ruby for a long while,"
she told Anne when they left Green Gables the next evening.
"but I really couldn't go alone. It's so awful to hear Ruby rattling on as she does, and pretending there's nothing the matter with her, even when she can hardly speak for coughing. She's fighting so hard for her life, and yet she hasn't any chance at all, they say."
The girls walked silently down the red, twilit road. The robins were singing vespers in the high treetops, filling the golden air with their jubilant voices. The silver fluting of the frogs came from marshes and ponds, over fields where seeds were beginning to stir with life and thrill to the sunshine and rain that had drifted over them. The air was fragrant with the wild, sweet, wholesome smell of young raspberry copses. White mists were hovering in the silent hollows, and violet stars were shining bluely on the brooklands.
"What a beautiful sunset,"
said Diana.
Look, Anne, it's just like a land in itself, isn't it? That long, low back of purple cloud is the shore, and the clear sky farther on is like a golden sea.
If we could sail to it in the moonshine boat Paul wrote of in his old composition, you remember? How nice it would be, said Anne, rousing from her reverie. Do you think we could find all our yesterdays there, Diana? All our old springs and blossoms? The beds of flowers that Paul saw there are the roses that have bloomed for us in the past.
Don't,
said Diana.
You make me feel as if we were old women with everything in life behind us.
I think I've almost felt as if we were since I heard about poor Ruby, said Anne. If it is true that she is dying, any other sad thing might be true too.
You don't mind calling in at Elisha Wright's for a moment, do you?
Asked Diana.
Mother asked me to leave this little dish of jelly for Aunt Atossa.
Who is Aunt Atossa?
Oh, haven't you heard? She's Mrs. Sampson Coates of Spencervale, Mrs. Elisha Wright's aunt. She's father's aunt, too. Her husband died last winter, and she was left very poor and lonely, so the Wrights took her to live with them. Mother thought we ought to take her, but father put his foot down. Live with Aunt Atossa he would not.
Is she so terrible? Asked Anne absently.
You'll probably see what she's like before we can get away,
said Diana significantly.
Father says she has a face like a hatchet. It cuts the air, but her tongue is sharper still.
Late as it was, Aunt Atossa was cutting potato sets in the Wright kitchen. She wore a faded old wrapper, and her gray hair was decidedly untidy. Aunt Atossa did not like being caught in a kilter, so she went out of her way to be disagreeable.
"Oh, so you're Anne Shirley,"
she said, when Diana introduced Anne.
"I've heard of you."
Her tone implied that she had heard nothing good.
"Mrs. Andrews was telling me you were home. She said you had improved a good deal."
There was no doubt Aunt Atossa thought there was plenty of room for further improvement. She ceased not from cutting sets with much energy.
"Is it any use to ask you to sit down?"
she inquired sarcastically.
"Of course, there's nothing very entertaining here for you. The rest are all away."
Mother sent you this little pot of rhubarb jelly,
said Diana pleasantly.
She made it today and thought you might like some.
"Oh, thanks,"
said Aunt Atossa sourly.
"I never fancy your mother's jelly. She always makes it too sweet. However, I'll try to worry some down. My appetite's been dreadful poor this spring. I'm far from well,"
continued Aunt Atossa solemnly.
"but still I keep a-doing. People who can't work aren't wanted here. If it isn't too much trouble, will you be condescending enough to set the jelly in the pantry? I'm in a hurry to get these spuds done tonight. I suppose you two ladies never do anything like this. You'd be afraid of spoiling your hands."
I used to cut potato sets before we rented the farm, smiled Anne.
I do it yet,
laughed Diana.
I cut sets 3 days last week. Of course,
she added teasingly,
I did my hands up in lemon juice and kid gloves every night after it.
Aunt Atossa sniffed.
"I suppose you got that notion out of some of those silly magazines you read so many of. I wonder your mother allows you. But she always spoiled you. We all thought when George married her she wouldn't be a suitable wife for him."
Aunt Atossa sighed heavily, as if all forebodings upon the occasion of George Barry's marriage had been amply and darkly fulfilled.
"Going, are you?" she
inquired, as the girls rose.
"Well, I suppose you can't find much amusement talking to an old woman like me. It's such a pity the boys ain't home."
We want to run in and see Ruby Gillis a little while,
explained Diana.
"Oh, anything does for an excuse, of course,"
said Aunt Atossa amiably.
"Just whip in and whip out before you have time to say how do decently. It's college airs, I suppose. You'd be wiser to keep away from Ruby Gillis. The doctors say consumption's catching. I always knew Ruby'd get something, getting off to Boston last fall for a visit. People who ain't content to stay home always catch something."
People who don't go visiting catch things too. Sometimes they even die,
said Diana solemnly.
"Then they don't have themselves to blame for it,"
retorted Aunt Atossa triumphantly.
"I hear you are to be married in June, Diana."
There's no truth in that report,
said Diana, blushing.
"Well, don't put it off too long,"
said Aunt Atossa significantly.
"You'll fade soon. You're all complexion and hair. and the rights are terrible fickle. You ought to wear a hat, Miss Shirley. Your nose is freckling scandalous. My, but you are red-headed. Well, I suppose we're all as the Lord made us. Give Marilla Cuthbert my respects. She's never been to see me since I come to Avonlea, but I suppose I oughtn't to complain. The Cuthberts always did think themselves a cut higher than anyone else round here.
Oh, isn't she dreadful?
Gasped Diana as they escaped down the lane. She's worse than Miss Eliza Andrews, said Anne. But then think of living all your life with a name like Atossa. Wouldn't it sour almost anyone? She should have tried to imagine her name was Cordelia. It might have helped her a great deal. It certainly helped me in the days when I didn't like Anne.
Josie Pye will be just like her when she grows up,
said Diana.
Josie's mother and Aunt Atossa are cousins, you know. Oh dear, I'm glad that's over. She's so malicious. She seems to put a bad flavor in everything. Father tells such a funny story about her. One time they had a minister in Spencervale who was a very good, spiritual man, but very deaf. He couldn't hear any ordinary conversation at all. Well, they used to have a prayer meeting on Sunday evenings, and all the church members present would get up and pray in turn, or say a few words on some Bible verse. But one evening Aunt Atossa bounced up. She didn't either pray or preach. Instead, she lit into everybody else in the church and gave them a fearful raking down, calling them right out by name and telling them how they all had behaved, and casting up all the quarrels and scandals of the past 10 years. Finally, she wound up by saying that she was disgusted with Spencervale Church, and she never meant to darken its door again, and she hoped a fearful judgment would come upon it. Then she sat down out of breath, and the minister, who hadn't heard a word she said, immediately remarked in a very devout voice, "Amen. The Lord grant our dear sister's prayer." You ought to hear Father tell the story.
Speaking of stories, Diana, remarked Anne, in a significant, confidential tone, do you know that lately I have been wondering if I could write a short story, a story that would be good enough to be published?
Why, of course you could,
said Diana, after she had grasped the amazing suggestion.
You used to write perfectly thrilling stories years ago in our old story club.
Well, I hardly meant one of that kind of stories, smiled Anne. I've been thinking about it a little of late, but I'm almost afraid to try, for if I should fail it would be too humiliating.
I heard Priscilla say once that all Mrs. Morgan's first stories were rejected, but I'm sure yours wouldn't be, Anne, for it's likely editors have more sense nowadays.
Margaret Burton, one of the junior girls at Redmond, wrote a story last winter, and it was published in the Canadian Woman. I really do think I could write one at least as good.
And will you have it published in the Canadian Woman?
I might try one of the bigger magazines first. It all depends on what kind of a story I write.
What is it to be about?
I don't know yet. I want to get hold of a good plot. I believe this is very necessary from an editor's point of view. The only thing I've settled on is the heroine's name. It is to be Avril Lester. Rather pretty, don't you think? Don't mention this to anyone, Diana. I haven't told anybody but you and Mr. Harrison. He wasn't very encouraging. He said there was far too much trash written nowadays as it was, and he'd expected something better of me after a year at college.
What does Mr. Harrison know about it?
Demanded Diana scornfully. They found the Gillis home gay with lights and callers. Leonard Kimball of Spencervale and Morgan Bell of Carmody were glaring at each other across the parlor. Several merry girls had dropped in. Ruby was dressed in white, and her eyes and cheeks were very brilliant. She laughed and chattered incessantly, and after the other girls had gone, she took Anne upstairs to display her new summer dresses.
I've a blue silk to make up yet, but it's a little heavy for summer wear. I think I'll leave it until the fall. I'm going to teach in White Sands, you know. How do you like my hat? That one you had on in church yesterday was real dinky. But I like something brighter for myself. Did you notice those two ridiculous boys downstairs? They both counted too mean to sit each other out. I don't care a single bit about either of them, you know. Herb Spencer is the one I like. Sometimes I really think he's Mr. Right. At Christmas I thought of Spencervale. Schoolmaster was that, but I found out something about him that turned me against him. He nearly went insane when I turned him down. I wish those boys hadn't come tonight. I wanted to have a nice good talk with you, Anne, and tell you such heaps of things. You and I were always good chums, weren't we?
Ruby slipped her arm about Anne's waist with a shallow little laugh. But just for a moment their eyes met, and behind all the lustre of Ruby's, Anne saw something that made her heart ache.
Come up often, won't you, Anne?
Whispered Ruby.
Come alone, I want you.
Are you feeling quite well, Ruby?
Me? Why, I'm perfectly well. I never felt better in my life. Of course, this congestion just went to pull me down a little. Just see my collar. I don't look much like an invalid, I'm sure.
Ruby's voice was almost sharp. She pulled her arm away from Anne, as if in resentment, and ran downstairs, where she was gayer than ever, apparently so much absorbed in bantering her two swains that Diana and Anne felt rather out of it, and soon went away. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Anne of the Island. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 12. Avril's Atonement.
What are you dreaming of, Anne?
The two girls were loitering one evening in a fairy hollow of the brook. Ferns nodded in it, and little grasses were green, and wild pears hung finely scented, white curtains around it. Anne roused herself from her reverie with a happy sigh. "I was thinking out my story, Diana."
Oh, have you really begun it?
cried Diana, all alight with eager interest in a moment. "Yes, I have only a few pages written, but I have it all pretty well thought out. I've had such a time to get a suitable plot. None of the plots that suggested themselves suited a girl named Avril."
Couldn't you have changed your name?
"No, the thing was impossible. I tried to, but I couldn't do it, any more than I could change yours. Avril was so real to me that no matter what other name I tried to give her, I just thought of her as Avril behind it all. But finally I got a plot that matched her. Then came the excitement of choosing names for all my characters. You have no idea how fascinating that is. I've lain awake for hours thinking over those names. The hero's name is Percival Dalrymple."
Have you named all the characters?
asked Diana wistfully.
If you hadn't, I was going to ask you to let me name one. Just some unimportant person. I feel as if I had a share in the story then.
"You may name the little hired boy who lived with the Lesters," conceded Anne. "He is not very important, but he is the only one left unnamed."
Call him Raymond Fitzosborne,
suggested Diana, who had a store of such names laid away in her memory, relics of the old Story Club, which she and Anne and Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis had had in their schooldays. Anne shook her head doubtfully. "I'm afraid that is too aristocratic a name for a chore boy, Diana. I couldn't imagine a Fitzosborne feeding pigs and picking up chips, could you?" Diana didn't see why, if you had an imagination at all, you couldn't stretch it to that extent, but probably Anne knew best, and the chore boy was finally christened Robert Ray, to be called Bobby should occasion require.
How much do you suppose you'll get for it?
asked Diana. But Anne had not thought about this at all. She was in pursuit of fame, not filthy lucre, and her literary dreams were as yet untainted by mercenary considerations.
You'll let me read it, won't you?
pleaded Diana. "When it is finished, I'll read it to you and Mr. Harrison, and I shall want you to criticize it severely. No one else shall see it until it is published."
How are you going to end it? Happily or unhappily?
"I'm not sure. I'd like it to end unhappily, because that would be so much more romantic. But I understand editors have a prejudice against sad endings. I heard Professor Hamilton say once that nobody but a genius should try to write an unhappy ending. And, concluded Anne modestly, I'm anything but a genius."
Oh, I like happy endings best. You'd better let him marry her,"
said Diana, who, especially since her engagement to Fred, thought this was how every story should end. "But you like to cry over stories."
Oh, yes, in the middle of them, but I like everything to come right at last.
"I must have one pathetic scene in it," said Anne thoughtfully. "I might let Robert Ray be injured in an accident and have a death scene."
No, you mustn't kill Bobby off,
declared Diana, laughing.
He belongs to me, and I want him to live and flourish. Kill somebody else if you have to.
For the next fortnight Anne writhed or revelled, according to mood, in her literary pursuits. Now she would be jubilant over a brilliant idea, now despairing because some contrary character would not behave properly. Diana could not understand this.
Make them do as you want them to,
she said. "I can't," mourned Anne. Avril is such an unmanageable heroine. She will do and say things I never meant her to. Then that spoils everything that went before, and I have to write it all over again." Finally, however, the story was finished, and Anne read it to Diana in the seclusion of the porch gable. She had achieved her pathetic scene without sacrificing Robert Ray, and she kept a watchful eye on Diana as she read it. Diana rose to the occasion and cried properly, but when the end came, she looked a little disappointed.
"Why did you kill Maurice Lennox?"
she asked reproachfully. "He was the villain," protested Anne. "He had to be punished."
"I like him best of them all,"
said unreasonable Diana. "Well, he's dead, and he'll have to stay dead," said Anne, rather resentfully. "If I had let him live, he'd have gone on persecuting Avril and Percival."
"Yes, unless you had reformed him."
"That wouldn't have been romantic, and besides it would have made the story too long."
"Well, anyway, it's a perfectly elegant story, Anne, and it will make you famous, of that I'm sure. Have you got a title for it?"
"Oh, I decided on the title long ago. I call it Avril's Atonement. Doesn't that sound nice and alliterative? Now, Diana, tell me candidly, do you see any faults in my story?"
"Well,"
hesitated Diana.
"that part where Avril makes the cake doesn't seem to me quite romantic enough to match the rest. It's just what anybody might do. Heroines shouldn't do cooking, I think."
"Why, that is where the humor comes in, and it's one of the best parts of the whole story," said Anne. And it may be stated that in this she was quite right. Diana prudently refrained from any further criticism, but Mr. Harrison was much harder to please. First he told her there was entirely too much description in the story.
"Cut out all those flowery passages,"
he said unfeelingly. Anne had an uncomfortable conviction that Mr. Harrison was right, and she forced herself to expunge most of her beloved descriptions, though it took 3 rewritings before the story could be pruned down to please the fastidious Mr. Harrison. "I've left out all the descriptions but the sunset," she said at last. "I simply couldn't let it go. It was the best of them all."
"It hasn't anything to do with the story,"
said Mr. Harrison.
"And you shouldn't have laid the scene among rich city people. What do you know of them? Why didn't you lay it right here in Avonlea, changing the name, of course, or else Mrs. Rachelellen would probably think she was the heroine."
"Oh, that would never have done," protested Anne. "Avonlea is the dearest place in the world, but it isn't quite romantic enough for the scene of a story."
"I dare say there's been many a romance in Avonlea, and many a tragedy, too,"
said Mr. Harrison dryly.
"but your folks ain't like real folks anywhere. They talk too much, and use too high-flown language. There's one place where that Dalrymple chap talks even on for 2 pages, and never lets the girl get a word in edgewise. If he'd done that in real life, she'd have pitched him."
"I don't believe it," said Anne flatly. In her secret soul, she thought that the beautiful, poetical things said to Avril would win any girl's heart completely. Besides, it was gruesome to hear of Avril, the stately, queen-like Avril, pitching anyone. Avril declined her suitors.
"Anyhow,"
resumed the merciless Mr. Harrison,
"I don't see why Maurice Lennox didn't get her. He was twice the man the other is. He did bad things, but he did them. Percival hadn't time for anything but mooning."
"Mooning. That was even worse than pitching." "Maurice Lennox was the villain," said Anne indignantly. "I don't see why everyone likes him better than Percival."
"Percival is too good. He's aggravating. Next time you write about a hero, put a little spice of human nature in him."
"Avril couldn't have married Maurice. He was bad."
"She'd have reformed him. You can reform a man. You can't reform a jellyfish, of course. Your story isn't bad. It's kind of interesting, I'll admit. But you're too young to write a story that would be worthwhile. Wait 10 years."
Anne made up her mind that the next time she wrote a story she wouldn't ask anybody to criticize it. It was too discouraging. She would not read the story to Gilbert, although she told him about it. "If it is a success, you'll see it when it is published, Gilbert, but if it is a failure, nobody shall ever see it." Marilla knew nothing about the venture. In imagination, Anne saw herself reading a story out of a magazine to Marilla, entrapping her into praise of it, for in imagination all things are possible, and then triumphantly announcing herself the author. One day Anne took to the post office a long, bulky envelope, addressed, with the delightful confidence of youth and inexperience, to the very biggest of the big magazines. Diana was as excited over it as Anne herself.
"How long do you suppose it will be before you hear from it?"
she asked. "It shouldn't be longer than a fortnight. Oh, how happy and proud I shall be if it is accepted."
"Of course it will be accepted, and they will likely ask you to send them more. You may be as famous as Mrs. Morgan some day, Anne, and then how proud I'll be of knowing you,"
said Diana, who possessed, at least, the striking merit of an unselfish admiration of the gifts and graces of her friends. A week of delightful dreaming followed, and then came a bitter awakening. One evening Diana found Anne in the porch gable, with suspicious-looking eyes. On the table lay a long envelope and a crumpled manuscript.
"Anne, your story hasn't come back?"
cried Diana incredulously. "Yes, it has," said Anne shortly.
"Well, that editor must be crazy. What reason did he give?"
"No reason at all. There is just a printed slip saying that it wasn't found acceptable."
"I never thought much of that magazine anyway,"
said Diana hotly.
"The stories in it are not half as interesting as those in the Canadian Woman, although it costs so much more. I suppose the editor is prejudiced against anyone who isn't a Yankee. Don't be discouraged, Anne. Remember how Mrs. Morgan's stories came back. Send yours to the Canadian Woman."
"I believe I will," said Anne, plucking up heart. "And if it is published, I'll send that American editor a marked copy. But I'll cut the sunset out. I believe Mr. Harrison was right." Out came the sunset, but in spite of this heroic mutilation, the editor of the Canadian Woman sent Avril's Atonement back so promptly that the indignant Diana declared that it couldn't have been read at all, and vowed she was going to stop her subscription immediately. Anne took this second rejection with the calmness of despair. She locked the story away in the garret trunk where the old Story Club tales reposed, but first she yielded to Diana's entreaties and gave her a copy. "This is the end of my literary ambitions," she said bitterly. She never mentioned the matter to Mr. Harrison, but one evening he asked her bluntly if her story had been accepted. "No, the editor wouldn't take it," she answered briefly. Mr. Harrison looked sideways at the flushed, delicate profile.
"Well, I suppose you'll keep on writing them,"
he said encouragingly. "No, I shall never try to write a story again," declared Anne, with the hopeless finality of 19 when a door is shut in its face.
"I wouldn't give up altogether,"
said Mr. Harrison reflectively.
"I'd write a story once in a while, but I wouldn't pester editors with it. I'd write of people and places like I knew, and I'd make my characters talk everyday English. And I'd let the sun rise and set in the usual quiet way, without much fuss over the fact. If I had to have villains at all, I'd give them a chance, Anne. I'd give them a chance. There are some terrible bad men in the world, I suppose, but you'd have to go a long piece to find them, though Mrs. Lynde believes we're all bad. But most of us have got a little decency somewhere in us. Keep on writing, Anne."
"No, it was very foolish of me to attempt it. When I'm through Redmond, I'll stick to teaching. I can teach. I can't write stories."
"It'll be time for you to be getting a husband when you're through Redmond,"
said Mr. Harrison.
"I don't believe in putting marrying off too long, like I did."
Anne got up and marched home. There were times when Mr. Harrison was really intolerable. Pitching, mooning, and getting a husband. Ow! End of chapter 12.